This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi, everyone. Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. We're so glad to have you on board here. And so today I am really pleased to have with us Dr. Roger Baldwin. I want to make sure I get that right, from the University of California, Davis. Some of you may call it UC Davis, but University of California, Davis, Professor of Extension, dealing with wildlife damage management. So this gentleman I've known for some time now. He's very involved in the Vertebrate Pest Conference. He's based, of course, in California, as you know from his professorship, but also he's done an incredible amount of research in the area of wildlife damage management, particularly in the area of dealing with things like voles and pocket gophers, and oftentimes agricultural conditions and more. And we're really glad to have him talking about some of these issues of the field and wildlife control. So welcome aboard, Dr. Baldwin.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, tell us a little about yourself. How'd you get involved in wildlife control or even in the field of wildlife?
Yeah. So actually, I grew up far away from California in Kansas, in a rural community on a farm there. I did a lot of hunting and fishing and trapping growing up with my dad. So that got me really interested in the wildlife side of things. Yet I was always interested in science too. So headed off to K-State, Kansas State University for my undergrad, where I majored in wildlife biology. Got an opportunity to work for the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at K-State and got involved with some research early on there with predators. And I really kind of decided at that point in time that research was the direction I wanted to go. So graduated, started to look into grad schools, and completed all of my graduate education, master's and PhD, and they were more basic ecology type programs and not so much, particularly on the wildlife damage side of things. But you graduate, you get done, you have to find a job, right?
Right.
And so start looking at some of those options that are out there, and University of California Department of Ag and Natural Resources, their cooperative extension component there, had an advisor position. Advisors are somewhat analogous to county agents for a lot of the other state extension systems, although they do have a little bit more robust of a research program in California. And they had a position open that was part of the statewide IPM program looking at vertebrate pest management. So I was like, well, I always like the applied side of things. Let's give that a try. So hopped on down there. It was a completely different experience for me. I've mostly done all predator work all the way through undergrad, graduate school. And this was going to be more focused on rodents and ag. So that was kind of a new experience for me. But as soon as I kind of got on the ground and got my feet underneath me, I realized, this is a lot of fun. There are a lot of folks that are really interested in having better answers for how to deal with these kinds of damage related situations versus, some of the more pure ecology work where it's important work, but a lot of times the research you do goes and ends up in a black box that nobody ever uses again. And I really felt like this kind of work is something that people are really interested in and really want and need. And you get that when you get out to a lot of these extension meetings and you give these talks and you talk to the folks afterwards and they're like, hey, this is great. This is something I can really use. And after you've been there for a few years, then it becomes, hey, I used some of what you told me about and it really worked. And I had great results with that. So I was there for 5 years with UC A&R in the Fresno area, and then a position opened up at UC Davis for my current position. So I've been up here for going on close to 8 years now.
Wow. Yeah.
Some of the same issues.
So tell me a little bit about let's start with some of your predator work. So what species were you working in terms of predators? Was it coyotes, or were you working with badgers or something?
Undergrad was coyotes, raccoons,
Okay.
possums, bobcats to a small
Oh,
extent, mostly
all right.
those mesopredators, if you will. And it was really more or less just a food habits and monitoring type
Okay.
project there. My master's was again the same mesopredators, raccoons, possums, and skunks. So this time, and specifically looking at microhabitat use. So
Oh,
the big impetus there was the work was done out at the Ames plantation, which is where the national field trial for bird dogs is at every year. So the dogs go out there and they judge them based on their ability to find quail, right, and
right.
fit all the guidelines for bobwhite quail. But they were experiencing real reductions in numbers of quail out there. And so I was one small part of a larger project. There were several PhD students working on it as well, trying to come up with better answers for what's going on with the quail out there and how we could bolster those populations. And so my
Mm,
part was looking at the mesopredator and uh, in part the nest predation components, although the PhD student was really looking at the nest predation component and I was looking at the habitat use and what areas they were
yeah.
used.
And what was any conclusions from that came out of that research? Were you?
It was still mostly, well, from my side, my project,
Yeah.
like the habitat components were pretty much what you expected. Closer to water is good for things like raccoons and bobcats, and greater abundance of trees and things like that. So it was mostly what you would expect, right?
Confirming what we already know.
Yeah, more or less. But from the broader scale, looking at the whole project overall and all the different components, it really was determined more or less that the predators probably weren't having that much of an impact on the quail population. It was more of a habitat issue, more of a changing in farming practices,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
cleaner farming, getting rid of some of the weedy stuff the quail like and some of those kinds of issues. Although certainly, the predators do have an impact and a role on them.
Right. Oh, interesting. Yeah, because it sort of boils down to, because our, in terms of wildlife control, our knee-jerk response is kind of like, well, let's go kill it, right? So rather than it, we sometimes aren't thinking about, well, really, this is a habitat change, and predators may be additive to that, but if we had to change one thing, the habitat needs would be bigger than the removal of predators. Probably is what your sounds like what you're saying.
Right. And
Yeah.
in a lot of cases that's so, but there are plenty of situations too where the predators do have a limiting impact on the prey
Right.
population out there as well. But in this case, I don't think that was the primary issue. It was more of a habitat
So
issue.
you went to California and you were working with, you started working with rodents. And what specific rodents were you working? And I do want to ask, were you working with Dr. Robert Tim as in the Hopland Center, or were you away from that particular facility?
Yeah, so I never really did do any work at Hopland, although
Okay.
certainly I engaged with Bob a lot.
Yeah.
We're both on the Vertebrate Pest Council, which we'll talk about a little bit later
Okay.
today.
Yeah.
And he and I did do some survey work early on, but I never did get involved with any of the coyote or predator type projects that were going on up at Hopland. Most of my work was on field rodents,
Hmm.
so particularly in this case, talking about ground squirrels, pocket gophers, and
Okay.
voles primarily, especially early on. I
Yeah.
have a few other critters that I work with now as
The
well.
California ground
Uh,
squirrels,
and yep,
or
so I was going to say specifically
yeah.
California ground squirrels early on, although I
Yeah.
also did some work with Beldings and have done a
Okay.
decent amount of work with Beldings ground squirrels in the northeastern part of the state as
Okay.
well. So yeah, here in California, ag here is quite a bit different than most of the other states. We have a ton of perennial crops, lots of tree crops, so orchard crops, whether that be nuts or fruits, vines, grapes, obviously, um, and then lots of alfalfa, which burrowing rodents are a major problem in alfalfa
Yes.
throughout
Yeah.
the U.S., not just in
Right.
California. So that
Right.
part is consistent elsewhere, but
Yeah.
the point I'm trying to make here is we have a tremendous amount of perennial crops.
Right.
And when you have those perennial crops, you have much less soil tillage. And when you don't have that soil tillage, these burrowing rodents can become established and do quite well in these areas. And so we see that in all these different crops. Some crops have bigger problems with ground squirrels, and maybe gophers are more of a moderate concern. And other crops, gophers are the primary and ground squirrels a little bit less so. But statewide in our ag systems, those are the two primary rodent species that cause damage. And then voles, of course, they rear their heads every now and then when you get those cyclical populations where you get those booms in voles, and then they cause all kinds of issues too. So a lot of my early work was really in trying to develop and test, some of the tools that can be used to manage those systems, and then ultimately to develop an integrated pest management program to try to deal with those kinds of damage situations. And a lot of that has transferred up to my work at Davis now as well.
Yeah. And so in terms of some of your work, you were looking at control methods. Did you ever get into the economics side of things, just sort of like tipping points where a producer needs to sort of evaluate, okay, now we're at a point where the enough density of the pest that it's now costing me money to make it justify control? Or was it more just, if you want to kill X, this is the method you're going to do it to get high levels?
Right. So it's a little bit of both, right?
Okay.
There's so many problems and so many questions that need to be answered. And so it's
Oh, I hear you. I
we're
hear you.
going to go
Yeah.
with this one or that one. But yes,
I hear you.
we have done some economic work.
Okay.
Now, I will say, trying to establish actual thresholds, that's really challenging because it varies so much from field to field, season to season, and things along those lines. But we have done some work on the amount of damage that rodents cause in a variety of different systems. One example is a study that was recently completed where we looked at ground squirrel, in this case, California ground squirrel damage in rangelands. And, if you have X number of ground squirrels, how much loss in forage production can you anticipate?
Right.
And so we did that study and we came up with pretty good numbers. Turns out 30, I'm ballparking it because I don't remember exactly, but
Yeah. Yeah.
let's say ballpark 30 pounds of forage per ground squirrel per acre are lost. And when you start looking at, substantial densities, 15 or 20 ground squirrels per acre, now all of a sudden this ends up being a pretty substantial amount. So
That's
maybe in those cases, it becomes worthwhile to engage in some level of ground squirrel management. But it's complicated with ground squirrels because California ground squirrels are a native species.
mhm,
Rangelands are where they exist. That's where we
right.
want them. So it's
Yeah.
not like we want to get rid of all ground squirrels. But certainly we have to understand that at some point when they get to a high enough level, then the economics become as such to where, management's probably going to be needed. And what this study really was able to show is that if you're dealing with low to even moderate densities, you're probably better off just, living with the ground squirrels out there because the economics of managing are quite expensive too. But once you get to those high densities, and so in this case, it would probably be small isolated situations, a few acres here or there, then trying to manage the ground squirrels becomes economically viable and
So is
beneficial.
that so I had, and again, we're not going to hold you to this, but just want to make sure I understood you correctly. So it's about each ground squirrel, 30 pounds per ground squirrel per acre. That would be it per year, or is that per
Per year.
season? Per
Per year.
year. And do your ground squirrels hibernate?
They do.
They
Yeah,
do hibernate.
they
And
do hibernate for a few months.
just a
Uh,
couple months. Okay.
Yeah. And to be honest, that also can vary from location to location and year to year. There are parts of the state where they don't hibernate, and there are parts where they hibernate for a longer period of time. So it depends on where you're at, but 2 to
Right.
3 months is probably a good average
Okay.
for hibernation.
That would be what elevation, probably, in terms of it gets colder, elevation issues, how dry it gets, maybe
Elevation and latitude both
latitude.
are,
Okay.
are going to be factors there. And certainly, to some extent, like all animals, body condition plays a factor. Like you were saying, if it's a really dry year and they haven't been able to put on the fat stores like they normally would, then they're probably going to hibernate a little shorter time frame
Okay.
than if they can enter into hibernation really fat and happy. So yeah, that could probably play a little bit, and age class does too. Your more mature animals will hibernate longer, whereas your juveniles actually you'll see them up above ground a lot in the winter. A lot of people think ground squirrels maybe aren't hibernating that particular year at that particular point in time because they see a few of them, but
Right.
those are the juveniles that just have to kind of get up and about because they still need to look for food.
Gotcha. Now, you did some work with the pressurized exhaust rodent control, which was a carbon monoxide. For those of you in the audience who don't know, that is I call it the Cadillac or maybe the Rolls-Royce version of carbon monoxide generators. It is a tricked out machine with multiple wands, depending on how many bells and whistles you get. And a lot of respect for that manufacturer. I don't make any money off this, folks. I'm just saying I respect manufacturers that put their materials out for research. And I think that because that's a very scary thing for manufacturing. You never know what someone's going to have, but he did it up. And so you were able to try that out on ground squirrels and I believe and pocket gophers, if I understand correctly. Can you want to talk about some of that a little bit for
Yeah,
our
absolutely.
audience in terms of
Yeah,
your
absolutely.
experience?
Yeah. So there are a few commercial products that I'm aware of that utilize this pressurized exhaust now. At least in California, there's four of them that are used. The one that was around first is the PERC machine, stands for
Mhm.
pressurized exhaust rodent controller. And it is a small engine that creates exhaust. It runs it through these coils that cools off that exhaust and then stores it in a compressor where they can then compress that gas. And then there's a series of hoses or probes that come off of that that allow you to inject this carbon monoxide heavy
Uh,
gas or concentration of gases into the burrow system. And, it's worked pretty well based on some of the trials that I've been involved with. For gophers, we've done a number of different trials, some real early on, some
yeah,
later on. And I think that some of the changes that they made to the equipment, and I don't know what they were, but some of the
right.
changes I think have improved it because we saw continually greater efficacy each time we trial it out. But overall, I would say for grounds or for gophers,
Yeah,
we've been seeing a reduction of about 65%
yeah.
after treatment. So that's pretty good. We can see better results with some other tools out there. But some of the
Mhm.
research we looked at also looked at the amount of time it took to treat an area, as well as the economics of
Yeah,
treating areas with the PERC machine versus some other fumigants and trapping. And certainly you have to consider the cost outlay initially for buying the machine because they're not cheap.
no, they're not. No.
But if you can use them continually over time, so if you're somebody, particularly if you have a pest control business where
Yeah,
you can amortize that cost out for an extended period of time, it becomes a much more cost effective tool to consider. If you're going to go that route. So I think there's a lot of utility for using them. I would I guess the caveat here being moderately effective for pocket gophers. We did also test them for ground squirrels, and they work better for ground squirrels. And
yeah,
so, if you're somebody who has ground squirrel issues, or maybe you can even talk a little bit about prairie dogs at some point, but for ground squirrels, we see really good results.
yeah.
For California ground squirrels, we had 100% removal
Oh,
in ideal conditions, and that would be
yeah,
moist soil conditions.
right.
But
Moist
we've
conditions.
also we've also tested them in dry conditions when fumigants generally do not work well, and we still had pretty good results. About 66% removal rates in dry conditions with the Perk machine. And
Yeah.
I can tell you, other fumigants like aluminum phosphide and gas cartridges would not work anywhere near as well in dry conditions. And so
Mm.
that kind of adds another extra utility to this tool. You're not quite so reliant on soil moisture. I would still recommend people use it when you have
Oh,
good
yeah,
soil moisture because that's going to give you a lot better results. But if you're forced into a situation where you had to,
yeah.
I think it works okay for ground squirrels, at least in those dry conditions.
Would you, so in terms of what was your injection time? Do you recall what your injection time was per
So
burrow?
one of the things I wanted to do is get some additional funding to look at the importance of injection time and what
Okay.
that ideal time frame is. And nobody's funded me yet on that one.
Gotcha.
But I can tell you that for the gopher work, we were looking at about 3 minutes
Three
per
minutes.
injection time.
Okay.
And same thing for the ground squirrels, although um, I guess I should take a step back. The one site or the one part of the study where we looked at it in ideal moist conditions, we had a longer injection time frame of about 6 minutes there. So
For the
that is a
ground
confounding
squirrel, for the ground squirrels or the
for
pocket
ground
gopher?
squirrels, for ground
Six
squirrels. So
six
that,
minutes.
yeah, it's a confounding variable there.
Yeah.
I will tell you that we didn't do the injection. We were simply following one of the professional pest control companies
Oh,
when they
okay.
did it.
All
So
right.
that was their strategy. And they based it on what they believed the size of that burrow system was. And so if they thought it was a larger burrow system, which by the way, California ground squirrels can have very large burrow systems,
Okay. All right.
they would inject for a longer period of time.
Mm,
Personally, I would guess that that's a bit overkill.
yeah,
I don't
that's
think you probably need it that long, but there could be conceivably at least scenarios where more than 3 minutes are needed,
right.
and that's what I would like to take a look at, but just haven't had that opportunity yet.
Yeah, I guess so. Here's the challenge that I have. Of course, I'm in here in Montana, and we don't have California ground squirrels. And the times that I've seen California ground squirrels, they made our ground squirrels look like a bunch of lazy bums in terms of the damage that I saw. The California ground squirrels seem to be much more concentrated in the the riddling through a mound was much more substantial than what I've seen here in Montana. And so it's hard for me to, how do I take your research and then apply it to the Richardson ground squirrels? Obviously, there's analogies there, but it's like, well, I still have to do some modification because your burrow systems are so much different with your California ground squirrels. That's been my impression.
Mhm.
Uh, so that's just simply incredible. I am amazed at the effectiveness of the pocket gopher side of things. You were using it on which species of the Badas pocket gopher do you recall?
I'm trying to recall. So most of that work was actually on Taupoides, the northern pocket gopher,
Northern pocket gopher.
because
Okay,
we're in the northern part of the state there. You are
gotcha.
correct that most of
Yeah,
California would be the
the
Badas.
Badas. Okay,
But yeah.
and so that's the same species as we have, and so I just wonder if you're when I was talking to the manufacturer, because obviously he was disappointed that they didn't get to a 70% efficacy rate, which was sort of like the gold
Sure.
standard. For
Yeah.
those of you in the audience, the EPA likes to have a method reach a 70% efficacy rate for rodents. I guess that's kind of a baseline standard. Nevertheless, he thought that perhaps a different technique or a modification, not so much with the machine, but actually with the use of the machine, might have gotten that extra 5% that you were mentioning. And I mean, that could be. I mean, we learn, I think people are improving their use of the machine all the time as we're starting to learn just how to use it in the field. But do you think that might be enough? Or maybe you go to 3.5 minutes and maybe that would be enough to get that extra 5%, maybe?
Tough to say.
Yeah.
One of the things that would have been nice, and if we'd had the opportunity to look at how injection time and its impact on efficacy
Mhm.
would have also been to start to monitor the concentrations of carbon monoxide in the burrow
That would
systems.
be
What
nice.
levels are we really reaching?
Yep.
And is there a way to enrich it even further to get even more carbon monoxide in? And would that increase the efficacy? I don't know. That's something that I think is worth potentially looking at.
Right.
I will say that I'm fairly certain that soil types and things like that are going to play into
Right.
how effective these machines are too. And certain soil types they're likely to work better in, and other soil types not near as good. And it could have been that the sites we were looking at were the best, and that's the best we could get,
Right.
or it could be that they were the worst,
Right.
and then it actually works a lot better. Likely the truth is somewhere in between,
Right.
but
Yeah, I'm
where
thinking wet clay probably would work really
yeah.
would work really well.
And these are really loamy soils where we did most of the gopher work. So
Yeah.
that probably does play into it to some extent. So I think if we'd have had more geographical variability, we'd be able to better answer that. Whereas the ground squirrel work was all done further south and different soil types and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm sure that there are things that can be done to
Yeah.
increase the efficacy of
I
it.
mean, I love your idea of having the test where you would have carbon monoxide sensors that you could then find. I would like to see, and I don't know if Perk will do this, but I haven't used Perk personally. Just for those of you in the audience who know Perk, like I said, Perk is, like, call it the Cadillac machine. This is one amazing machine. I was able to be with a gentleman who used it on prairie dogs, and it's quite a device. But they are pricey, anywhere from $7,000 to $17,000. I think 9,000. I think might be one of the lower prices. But it all depends on how many bells and whistles you get. So there's a lot of variability in terms. But a baseline package is somewhere between $7,000 and $9,000. So it's a serious investment. Uh, where I've used the Burrow RX on prairie dogs, but it only has one hose, so you're stuck with one hose. But one thing that I did like about it was the smoke oil. In some ways it felt a little gimmicky, but it told me immediately if there was another hole connected. And so I would think with your California ground squirrels, that it would have been really helpful to know that when you're wanding this one hole, whether it's connected with other holes in the area, because like I said, when I looked at California ground squirrels, that mound looked like Swiss cheese. I mean, it was amazing. Our ground squirrels don't do that. They may have 4 or 5 holes that are connected, but nothing like what I saw out there in California. So I'm wondering if that would be a help, at least for the user, to know that, well, I'm to make sure they close all those openings, because how do you tell without the smoke? You can't tell, right? It's
Right.
just a guessing game.
So it's a great question, a great point. You
Yeah.
can sort of tell in some cases.
Okay.
You can look for airflow. You see dust coming out when you
Okay.
start injecting, but that's not 100%, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a lot of times it's just, fumigate this one for a while, plug it up, and if you're not sure, you fumigate the other openings too.
Okay.
And so that adds time. So yes, if you had better detection capabilities, that could potentially reduce that. And like you said, there is the Burrow RX, and I believe the CO Jack, which is another device, also
Oh,
allows
that's a new
you.
one. I haven't heard of that one. CO
Yeah,
Jack?
yeah.
Okay.
So I guess if I had to define it, I would define it more as a cross between the Perk and the Burrow RX.
Oh, really?
It
Okay.
is similar to the Perk in that you can treat multiple Burrow systems at once. In other words, they have
Oh,
the
okay.
larger units.
Yeah.
But like the Burrow RX, they do have the oil additive capabilities that create that smoke. Now,
Okay.
I don't recall all the exact details, but I have heard that there is some potential concern that adding the oil that creates the smoke could perhaps not be legal for some reason, and
Yeah.
I haven't heard the details. So,
Yeah.
it could be down the road that maybe that goes away, or maybe it doesn't, and that's not a concern. I don't know, but
Yeah. Yes, there's EPA might rear its head and try to ban that too. The rule of thumb is, in my opinion, and I'm not putting this on you, but my opinion is if something works, it gets banned. So the more it works, the faster it gets banned. So I'm pretty pessimistic about this. Well, and so let's move on now. You've done some work also with trapping, I believe, with pocket gophers, and let's talk a little about your research with that.
yeah. So trapping, I personally feel, is an underrated and underappreciated tool when it comes to managing gophers. It's challenging for ground squirrels and it's impossible for voles. But gophers, I think, are kind of that sweet spot where um, they oftentimes are at densities that are low enough where trapping becomes a viable tool. One of the great things about trapping is that it's highly efficacious. We've seen 92 to 94% removal rates with trapping after 2 sessions through a field. And secondly, if you got rid of the animal. If you're using fumigants, if you're using rodenticides, you can monitor and you can get a general feel for how effective you were, but you don't really know for sure that you got rid of, this gopher or that gopher.
Right.
And another great thing about trapping too is it forces you to learn about the system that you're working in. And so, if you're trapping and let's take this as an example. You've got a number of mountains in a particular area. Is that one gopher? Is it 2 gophers? Could it even be 3 gophers? How far apart do you need to set your traps, or how far
Right.
apart would you need to bait? Or if you were using fumigants, how far apart would you need to fumigate? If you're trapping, you start to learn that, you know what? Um, Gophers in this big of an area, probably one individual.
Right.
because you only catch one, and you put a trap here and you catch one, and you put one 30 feet away and you don't catch one, and another 30 feet away in another direction you don't catch one. Well, guess what? That was probably one gopher.
Mm.
But when you get into really high density areas, you catch one here and one there, and maybe they're only 15 feet apart, and you go, geez, I really thought that was only one gopher, and it turns out it was two. So when you're trapping, you can start to learn that about that system and how they're spacing themselves out there and how they're using, some of those areas. And then if you want to come back to and do some bait application or fumigation at another time, you have a better understanding of that system as well. But getting back to just the general trapping program,
Mm.
there's lots of different traps. We've tested some different traps. The Gofinator is a trap, for example, that we've used that's tested really well, particularly compared to the standard Maccabee style trap,
Yeah.
in particular because it allows us to catch larger gophers at a greater rate. And we've done a lot of research on that. Basically, we broke it down into 35-gram categories, if you want to get sciencey here.
Okay.
And for each increase in size class, we caught about 23 to 25% more when using the Gofinator, and that compounded. So it was 23 to 25% here, but it goes up by that much here and here and here. And by the
Nice.
time
Nice.
you're getting out
Okay.
to those largest size classes, we're still catching them with the Gofinator, and we didn't catch any at all with the Maccabee. So it's a really good trap. There's lots of other traps, and of course, there's
Yeah.
different sizes of gophers, right? So
Yeah.
the genus that we have in California is smaller. Some of the ones you have in the plain states or even some of the southwestern locations are larger gophers, and you probably need a little larger trap in those kind of systems. So
There are two
the trap goes
versions of
higher.
the Gofinator, right? So you have two
Correct.
sizes. Did you use the small size for yours, or you use the
No,
larger one?
use the large size.
Larger ones.
But good trappers will carry a few of the small ones with them too.
Okay.
And the reason why is that the juveniles are the perfect size for that small trap, which was designed
Ah.
for moles. That's really a mole trap. But it turns out it's the ideal size for a juvenile gopher. And gopher size oftentimes is reflected by the tunnel size. And so if you get a large tunnel, it's probably a large gopher.
Gotcha.
For sure, if you get a small tunnel, it's definitely a small gopher.
Yeah.
And you can use those larger traps, but you have to spend a lot of time digging down the sides of the tunnel.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
that just takes time. If you have those small traps, you just slide them right in there and away you go. So you can
Very
trap
nice.
more quickly that way.
Did you find one of the challenges with trapping, of course, is that it can be consuming to check the traps, and so like with the black hole trap, the trap stays above ground, and so you're able to see just walking by whether it's sprung or not. But with the inside the tunnel traps, you don't know if it's buried because it caught something or whether it's buried because the pocket gopher got the best of you and buried the trap. So did you have any techniques on how you would increase the efficiency on your trap checks that you'd be able to
So
share?
um, first, the best thing to do is increase the efficiency of your trapping, period, so
Right.
that you
Okay.
catch a greater proportion of them. And we did do we've done a lot of work in those areas. We've looked at using attractants, peanut butter or anise oil. I mean, that my dad always used anise infused petroleum jelly for raccoons and stuff like that, right? So I was like, well, why not try that for raccoons, or I'm sorry, for gophers? And so we looked at a number of attractants. That didn't really matter too much. We looked at human scent. Do we have to exclude human scent from the traps? And that didn't matter.
Right.
We looked at whether or not you need to cover a trap set.
Right.
A lot of times people will dig a hole, put the traps in, and cover that up, but that takes time to cover it up.
Right.
And so if you can be just as effective without covering it up, then that's maybe a way to go. And so we looked at that, and generally speaking, non-covered traps are just as effective as covered traps, so that saves some time. So on the trap checking side of things, and then from an actual trapping perspective, one of the best two or three things you really need to do when you dig down and you're putting those traps, you need to clear out that loose soil from those tunnels.
Okay.
When you clear out that loose soil, it makes it much more difficult for the gopher to push a whole bunch of dirt into that trap and plug it up.
Okay.
Secondly, you want the trap to be shoved as far in the tunnel as you can get it. In particular, you definitely have to have that trigger part completely within the tunnel system. If it's sticking out a little bit, there's a good chance that the gopher is just going to plug that up before it ever even gets to the point of activating it. And third, you want it nice and flat. You don't want it rocking back and forth because they can feel that. And if they do, then that's going to reduce the likelihood that you're going to catch them. So by doing all of that, probably 8 to 9 times, uh, eight, 80 to 90% of the time, let's put it that way, of trap triggerings will result in a capture. So if a gopher is there, and you're doing all of those things right, I bet you're going to get them 80 to 90% of the time. You'll still get some plugging, you'll still
Right.
miss some from time to time. There's no way around that.
So I
And then just getting on the trap check part of things. Um, when we come along and check, it's simply just looking down real quick. Yeah, okay, it's set. It's triggered. You can tell pretty easy that way. And if it's plugged, you got to deal with it anyways.
right, right.
It's either a capture or you missed them and you got to go back and do it. I will say there is a newer trap out there now called the Gopher Hawk. I don't know if you've seen that one or not.
I've heard of it, but
It's
do
been
tell.
around for a few
Yep.
years. I haven't had a chance to test it, but it is rapidly gaining popularity here in California, at least. And one of the nice things about it is it's got a probe attached to the trap. More or less, you pull the probe off, and you're basically just creating a hole in the ground into the tunnel system.
Hmm.
When you get that, you then take the trap. It's a cylinder, and you just put the trap directly into it. And it's got some loops in there. Once it's activated, you just push it down to
Yeah.
activate it, and then the gopher just crawls through the loops and it hits this little trigger part and it activates it. And the great thing about it is the rest of the trap sticks up above ground, and once it's activated, it's got yellow on that bar. So when it's pushed down, you don't see the yellow, but once it's been released, you got this big yellow flag out there. And so you can really just scan with binoculars or something from a long distance and tell, if those traps have been triggered or not.
So you would place that you'd find the main tunnel then, rather than using the lateral tunnel,
That's
which
right.
most of us gotcha. So it's a main tunnel trap. Yeah, I have not. I owned one, and I think I might have broke it. I don't know, but I didn't. I haven't had it. I haven't used it in the field yet. So I'm glad you mentioned that, the Gopher Hawk. So I'm gonna have to try that out. In price, do you remember what it might cost?
The Gopher Hawk is more expensive.
Yeah.
I want to ballpark it at like $30, maybe for I don't know. I don't remember if it comes in a pack of two or if that's just one. I'd
Okay.
have to look on that.
Yeah.
Whereas the Maccabee, or sorry, the Gopherninator style, particularly if you're buying in bulk, you can get for $7 a trap,
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like that. So
What I loved about the Gophinator is that it didn't require, it was like the DK1 in the sense there was nothing pushing the floor, because when I was
yep,
using the Maccabi on the Plains pocket gopher, which is one of the largest one in the United States, is that sometimes you get these belly catches
that's right.
because the animal's moving up.
Yeah,
It's sort of like those of you in trapping, is think of it as a jump trap. The jump trap is actually pushing the animal out of the trap as it's closing, and so that's the same problem with the Maccabi. So I wanted actually two jaws in longer tines that would come over and try to make up the distance faster, because
yeah,
I like the compactness of the Maccabi, but it had that challenge with it.
yeah. The capture mechanism of the Gophinator was designed based on the design for the DK1.
Yeah, yeah,
He looked at that and it's like, that's a good component of that
it
trap. Let's
is.
let's
Yeah.
add that in there. And so it's got that swinging arm mechanism that doesn't let go. Whereas, with some of the other traps, like you said, that upward thrusting motion does tend to either push them out or barely catches them, and then you've got those issues to deal with.
Yeah, so that's amazing. So why don't we transition over to the Vertebrate Pest Conference? So you're part of the Vertebrate Pest Council of California. Tell the audience what that organization is and the value that it is for them, even though they may not live in California, and the benefits of it for California as well.
Yeah, so the Vertebrate Pest Council is a group of individuals in the profession. They've been around for, gosh, 60 years now or
Yeah,
so.
it's a long time.
Started by Dr. Howdy Howard and some individuals who was at UC Davis, and then some individuals with CDFA. And they really were lamenting the fact that there wasn't a group out there able to deal with these kinds of vertebrate pest related issues. And so they got a group of individuals together, like I said, many decades ago, trying to come up with some educational forums to educate uh, PCOs, PCAs, growers, anybody who is interested in more information and how to deal with a lot of these vertebrate pest related issues. And so our council now is made up of academic folks, people from UC Davis, folks with the National Wildlife Research Center, which is part of USDA APHIS, a lot of the state agencies, whether that be Department of Food and Ag,
Mhm.
Department of Pesticide Regulation, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and then also pest control operators. We have one or two of those on the committee as well. And we have a couple of educational opportunities, one for each year. And the one that's coming up this year in March 7th through 10th, is the Vertebrate Pest Conference. And this is a 4-day conference where we cover all sorts of issues related to vertebrate pest management. These can certainly be rodent related issues. Probably year in, year out, we have more rodent talks than anything, I would guess.
Yeah.
In ag, in structural pest related areas, you name it, and highland conservation too. I mean, we cover the whole gamut there.
Right.
But there's also a lot of work these days, a lot of research focused on rodenticide related issues, because there's a lot of interest in rodenticides and reducing the potential impact to non-target species of those rodenticides. And so a lot of work that goes on in those areas. But then a lot of work in predator livestock areas. We have a special symposium for this year on hoofed animals, so wild horses and deer damage in certain areas, and those kind of related issues. And just a lot of information on developing and implementing more effective management programs for dealing with these species. So it's really a broad program. We cover a lot of areas. Some of the research, for example, may be more specific to ag, but would be broadly applicable to urban and residential areas. I know a lot of my work, for example, is in agricultural systems, but knowing how to more effectively trap gophers is applicable in many areas.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of overlap from that perspective. A little bit more about the conference. Like I said, it's March 7th through 10th. It's in Reno, Nevada this year.
Reno this year, getting out of
Yeah,
California, so
that's
I'm
right.
excited
That's
about
right.
that. Yeah.
The first day is a field trip. It's the full day field trip, but the field trips are always a lot of fun, and they're very educational, a lot of hands-on
I'm
information.
looking forward to it this year. I'm going to attend that one. Yep.
Yep. So that's a full day deal there. And then Tuesday through Thursday is when we have our concurrent sessions. And so that's when we have a lot of the presentations on covering all the different topics that I talked about. And we also have, of course, commercial exhibitors providing, all sorts of information on the products that they have. So it's a great educational and learning experience. I don't know if any of the folks on listening to this podcast are from California or Nevada. We will be offering continuing education credits for those particular states, but unfortunately, we can't cover all the states.
Sure. And I just want to point out, for those of you who are interested in attending this, it has they have a number of people that come from the Pacific Rim. So that would be like New Zealand and Australia. And let me tell you something. New Zealand and Australia, they have done some incredible work on vertebrate control. It is amazing, some of the work that they've done, and they have some tools that I envy. And some of them are starting to move to the US. I'm thinking about the A24. I've been playing with it at a site right now. This is, for those of you who don't know, it's a gas powered, I call it a captive bolt. So basically the mouse sticks its head up into it and bam, he gets hit by a bar and then resets, which is really cool. So you have a toxicant free method of controlling rats and mice. And so those are some things that you'll often hear some people using that in actual field research, controlling invasive species around endangered species. So it is amazing to see some of this stuff. So if you're looking to get yourself stretched, and then they publish, and so a lot of these proceedings get published later on, usually within a year afterwards, and so you can then get things in print. But the presentations are short, 20 minutes, typically that's all they give you, so you're getting 3 presentations in an hour, and then you can, of course, talk to the speaker afterwards, because it's a pretty low-key event in that regard.
Yeah, it's a very low-key event. Lots of opportunity to interact directly with anybody that you might want to interact with.
Absolutely.
And you're absolutely right. There are folks coming from throughout the world presenting on their information.
Yep.
There'll be a number of folks from Europe this year.
Oh, it really? Okay.
Yeah. And we're always well represented by New Zealand and Australia, which really do set the standard for
it's amazing. So how did you get more Europeans? Because typically when the years I've been, I haven't really noticed a big push from Europe. There'd be a couple people in there,
but not many. Yeah.
So,
and I wouldn't say that there's going to be a ton, but we do have several speakers from Europe, including our keynote speaker.
Okay.
Is coming there. Several of them are talking on rodenticide related issues. We have a special It's not technically a symposium, but we have a full day devoted to a lot of these rodenticide related issues. And so there's a lot of folks doing some really great work on rodenticide and trying to reduce risks to rodenticides over there.
Yeah, well, that's going to be exciting because it is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. As some of our audience may know, California has basically, I can't say completely eliminated second gen rodenticides. However, they've certainly significantly reduced the legal use of second gens, except for some very specific exceptions. So on a practical basis, they're not going to be commonly used anymore unless there's certain health issues that are involved where they can be appealed to, where they can get a permit to apply them. Is that a correct understanding of how that's going with second gens?
Relatively so, although there is
Okay.
still a carve out for agricultural use too.
Okay.
Not for field rodents; they've never been
Right.
registered for, but for rats and mice and around structures on farms,
Okay.
food processing facilities, places
Yeah.
like that. They're still legal for use, and technically, and I've been this has been stressed to me multiple times. They haven't been banned at this point. The second gens, there's just a moratorium on their use while they review the whole registration process a little bit further. So the thought is that within a year or two, there's going to be some more final decisions on what the future of these second generation products are, and they may come back at least for more limited use than
Hmm.
to say more expansive than what's currently available, but more limited than what had
What have
historically been
been there
available.
in the past? So where do you see this going? I mean, that's obviously been a significant, and I do blame part of our industry as for part of this problem. I've been trying to get manufacturers to change the design of their bait station. And so I'm not putting this on you. I've been saying we need to have, I want a bait station where we have a sliding door that goes from a rat size to a mouse size. Cause a lot of times people are using rat size bait stations when they know there are no rats there. So they're trying to control mice. Well, why don't we just have a sliding door that makes it only mice can get in? It seems like a really no-brainer event, and the people would say, "Yeah, that's a great idea. No, we're not going to do it." So, I mean, it seems because you'll have squirrels running in there, you'll have other larger animals that are consuming stuff, and I say, "How can that be good?"
Yeah,
And so, where do you see this all going in California? Because as California goes, the rest of the country goes.
yeah, that's true.
Hmm.
And it's a great question. Obviously there's more and more pressure on the use of these anticoagulant rodenticides, but there's so much that we don't know about that secondary exposure risk. And so a lot of the research right now is kind of being focused on that. I'm doing a little bit of it. A colleague of mine, Dr. Neve Quinn,
Quinn,
who's
yeah.
also in California, is doing more of it. She's focusing a large portion of her program on it, but really kind of looking at what that exposure risk is and where is this exposure to non-target species coming from. And so if it's coyotes or foxes or bobcats or something like that, are they get it from eating intoxicated target species, in other words rats and mice, or
Hmm.
is it other critters that are getting into the bait stations that they're consuming? And so there's more and more work trying to narrow that down. So that's one of the areas that folks are looking at. There also needs to be more risk, I think, or more assessments on what the actual risk is to non-target species. When we start to look at anticoagulant exposure in these animals, more times than not, they're really just reporting animals that have
Right.
shown exposure.
Right.
But is that exposure actually negative or detrimental to the animal?
Yeah.
At some point, it certainly is.
Yeah.
But where is that threshold? Um, it's it's difficult to assess that because the threshold is different from not only across species but within individuals within a,
Right.
a, a
Yeah.
population. So that makes
Yeah.
it challenging. But we need to do some kind of assessment along those lines and start to assess not only what thresholds does it impact the animal, but also are we seeing population level effects, or is it really just one or two animals here or there that are experiencing some kind of negative response or death from it, but it's really not impacting the population as a whole. So there's lots of things that need to be assessed on that. But as far as where we go and how we reduce that risk, some of the research is going to direct us in directions to go, but some of it also is underway, and that's simply looking at new toxicants? Are there additional toxicants that we could use that would be just as effective? I've looked at, for example, combining cholecalciferol with anticoagulants, and the
Yeah.
benefit there is that they're highly efficacious, but we can lower the amount of the anticoagulant that we need to use. And so maybe something along those lines could be beneficial. There's folks looking at norbormide again, which is a rat-specific toxicant. And so, if the palatability of that could be increased to the point where it's highly efficacious against rats, then that's a tool we can use for rats that we don't have to worry about non-target exposure. And
Yeah.
even with the anticoagulants, this is getting way above my pay grade, but
Right.
there are a lot of chemists looking at the anticoagulants, and there's ways of flipping little things in the chemistry that will essentially be brodifacoum, for example, yet, but no longer has secondary exposure risks or greatly
Oh,
reduced
wow.
secondary exposure risks. Now, they're not there yet, and maybe
Right.
they'll never get there, but there's a lot of promising work on that end. And so, the hope is that maybe ultimately we can get to the point where we can substantially reduce that non-target exposure,
That
either
would
with
be,
new
yeah.
toxicants or by modifying some of the current ones we have.
Yeah, that would be amazing, because just to sort of rephrase this for our audience, and that is the question is, when researchers are going out into the environment and they're capturing animals, or they're seeing carcasses and they're testing them for the presence of, let's say, um, cocalciferol, I mean, anticoagulants. Let's go with bromadiolone or something. They're trying to see, does bromadiolone, is it in the environment? And they're testing it, but they're often testing it down to billions, the
Parts
billionth
per
level, and
billion.
they're like, oh yeah, we found it, we
Yeah.
found bromadiolone. And so what Dr. Baldwin's saying is, so yeah, it's there, but did it actually negatively affect the animal? Did it have a level that actually affected the animal negatively? And so that's a big question. Right now, they're just finding wherever they're looking, they seem to find it, though. They're finding these anticoagulants everywhere. So now the question that I'm having is like, okay, you have this moratorium on second gens. How many, in I'm sure the research is probably going to continue. So let's say 3 years out, and they're testing animals in nature again, they're still finding second gens. So then the question is, well, where did it come from? If people haven't been using it, where is these second gens coming from? Are they have a long half-life, but man, it's not 3 years, at least not yet. And a lot of these animals are dying anyways. So how does this I mean, because I think the UK has almost had some of these major restrictions, and they're still finding anticoagulants out in the environment. So is first gens, is that going to be the answer for us here, to resolve some of this problem?
The short answer to that specific question is, I would say probably no.
Right.
There are issues with, I mean, the first gens work great for a lot of our field rodents and continue to be kind of the preferred tool in a lot of situations, not all, but a lot of
Right.
situations for some of those field rodents. But I think for our commensal rodents, switching over to first generation products is really kind of a recipe for disaster, because the reason we switched to second gens is because of resistance buildup in commensal rodent populations. And if you start relying on them heavily again, then you're going to see that resistance build up. And there's actually some work looking at resistance in rats and mice in the US, and they're starting to find the gene that is responsible for that in these populations. And so
Mm.
certainly, there's the potential that if you start, moving in that direction, that you're going to have that kind of issue. So, I don't think that relying exclusively on first generation products as your toxicant of choice for rats and mice that's probably not the long-term answer. You're going to need something else, whether that be trying to come up with safer ways of using the second generation products, maybe combining cholecalciferol with first gens, that
Yeah.
increases to potency to levels equivalent to brodifacoum, which is the best thing we got out there. So that's always a potential possibility. Modifying the anticoagulants to make them less hazardous is a possibility, or looking at things like bromethylene or cholecalciferol, which is the direction people are moving to in the short term, at least. That's potentially an option
But
too. But efficacy isn't as good,
But
with
are
those
you
products.
concerned though? We don't seem to have the research on bromethylene for terms of secondary poisoning.
Sure.
It seems like people are embracing this rodenticide. And when I was trying to do some research in it, I'm like, well, there's nothing. It's like
There's very little. Yeah.
very little, and yet,
And
oh, this is we're going to just make this available for the general
well,
public. And I read an article that says, yeah, we have like no research on this hardly enough with secondary poisoning, but yet it's embraced as the consumer this consumer savior here. And I'm like, well, how does that work?
Well, and we're either the only country or certainly one of the only countries that actually has bromethylene. Nobody else uses it for any number of reasons, I suppose. But
Right.
so yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty about it. I will say that since we've had this moratorium on second generation products, we are seeing bromethylene show up more and more in non-target wildlife. And so the question then
Surprise,
becomes,
surprise.
right. So is the risk secondary exposure though, or is it primary exposure
Primary
in the
exposure.
animals feeding on the bait directly? And
Yeah.
that's still the question we haven't answered for the anticoagulants, let alone something like bromethylene. So again, like I said, there's a lot of unanswered questions about
Gosh.
that exposure route. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it is certainly amazing. The field is, we're very grateful because you had the Vertebrate Pest Conference and the Vertebrate Pest Council. You folks, how are you funded? Are you some money from the registration of rodenticides in California, or are you funded through other means?
So the Vertebrate Pest Council, the only funding we get is through attendance at the conference,
Okay,
and we have off-year seminars where we offer continuing education
okay,
for information that we provide. So yeah, entirely based on people attending, conferences and our off-year seminars. So completely nonprofit.
yeah.
The money go 100% of it goes back into supporting the industry, the conference, and everything.
Any desire to expand it out into additional states, to broaden its scope? Because we have the Wildlife Damage Management Conference, which typically is sort of east of the Mississippi River, give or take. And the Vertebrate Pest Conference is west of the Mississippi River. Is there any, but it's still very concentrated in the California milieu. Is there any desire to expand this out to a more regional experience, to have other representation from other states, or is it just going to remain dominated by California?
It's been discussed obviously in the past, and we've had very minor expansion from the standpoint that this will be the second time we've been in Reno. We've been to
Yeah,
Hawaii, which, well, that hadn't happened for decades before.
sure.
So we have expanded slightly from that
Yeah,
perspective. But yeah, I think logistically it becomes complicated to expand too far out. We certainly encourage everybody from throughout the U.S. to come and attend. The information is relevant nationwide and globally, quite frankly, as illustrated by
yeah.
the international folks that come and attend. But as far as the council members, it's dominated by people from California, but it's not exclusive. We have a couple of folks from the National Wildlife Research Center in Colorado. We have
Colorado.
a couple of faculty from Utah that are part of it.
Yeah,
And I
I
may
remember
be
that.
leaving somebody else out that's slipping my mind, but
Sure.
we do have some representation from other states, but it's broadly, of course,
Yeah,
historically.
it's and VPC, the Vertebrate Pest Conference, is the longest running
Yeah.
vertebrate pest conference. I mean, wildlife damage control conference, I believe, in the world.
I think that's correct.
Yeah, I think the longest continuous. You started in, I think, 1960, 1962,
60 or 62. Yeah, I should
somewhere
know the
back
answer
there.
to
It
that, but
goes
it
way
was one
back.
of those two. It was one of those
Yeah,
two. Yeah.
and I'll tell you, the vertebrate pest proceedings are a wealth of information. If you and I'll probably put a link on the website, on the
Freely available.
podcast,
Yeah.
for the Vertebrate Pest Conference, and there's a wealth of information there. Any final thoughts you'd want to leave for your viewers? Views of the future? Where are you pessimistic about the future of wildlife control in terms of, are we going to go into a sort of a dark ages where we're just going to be using traps? Are we going to be forced to traps and all cage traps, because we seem to be getting banned from both directions? We can't use the traps because they're cruel, and we can't use the toxicants because they're environmentally unsound. And so are we just going to go out and hug all our animals to death? Or what do you see the future as?
It's obviously increasingly challenging,
Yeah,
and it certainly does feel like every time something new comes along, something else gets taken away.
yeah,
And One of the things I think that needs to be stressed, not necessarily to this group, but to the regulators, is that oftentimes they'll fall back. Well, you can use this instead. Well, that may be true that there may be one other tool out there, but effective management doesn't rely on one or even two tools. It relies on a toolbox
Yeah.
that's full of tools specifically fitted for certain needs. And so we continue to need all of these different tools in order to most effectively manage these species. And by having all of these different tools, it reduces our reliance on any single one tool, therefore reducing that potential negative impact that it might have, on environments or non-target species and whatnot. So it's obviously easy to be pessimistic, but it's there's challenges for sure, but there's
Yeah.
opportunities, to come up with new answers for dealing with these challenges. And some of it could be simply be looking at different isomers for anticoagulants, for example, that reduce that secondary exposure, but still keep them just as effective. And so there's opportunities, to look at some of these different tools. And the one great thing about technology is as technology advances, it allows us opportunities to look at some of those different options more rapidly than maybe we would have been able to
Yeah.
do
Well,
previously. And an example of that would be the A24 trap. People
yeah.
who are concerned about the humaneness of traps, this trap is very humane. It's been tested many times. It kills the animal instantly, or at least renders them unconscious instantly. And so, if there's increasing pressure, against some of the other kinds of traps and tools that are out there, hopefully the technology will get there to where we're able um, uh, get over some of those potential
Yeah,
limitations.
no, I would agree. I'm a negative Nelly. I admit that. I see the glass as always half empty rather than half full. But I am intrigued by that comment you made about the work they're doing with some of the chemistries. I haven't heard that yet, and I guess my concern there would be is would the EPA still require the full on treatment of this as a new chemical, or would they just simply see it as a mirror image of the chemical with some benefits? And
Right.
so if that's the case, then you have to look at cost effectiveness because we don't have the revenue stream. I envy people that deal with weeds and bugs. They
Yeah.
have billion-dollar corporations because they can afford to do all that
Yeah.
research. And when it comes to vertebrate control, we have some fairly big rodenticide companies, but they're nowhere near the size of some of
Yeah.
these uh, pesticide companies that dealing with weeds and bugs. I mean, it's trophic levels. So I'm a little bit more concerned. Well,
Yeah.
Dr. Baldwin, we really want to thank you for being on our show today, and we hope you will definitely come back. Let me sort of remind the audience of your who you are and your title. So this is You've been listening to Dr. Roger Baldwin, University of California, Davis. He is the professor of extension who deals with wildlife damage management and human wildlife conflicts. He's been doing a lot of work in California in the area of rodent control. He's even done some predator control in his earlier life as well. And we're really glad to have him. So definitely check him out. Also check out the opportunity to go to the Vertebrate Pest Conference if you happen to be in the Reno area. You want to be able to register as soon as possible before the price increases, of course. That's going to be held March 7th and 10th of this year. That's 2022. It's going to be in Reno, which is sort of the baby Las Vegas, as they call it, the little Las Vegas. And it's the Vertebrate Pest Conference day one, which is Monday, is a field trip. That's going to be a great day. I looked at the schedule for that. That's going to have a nice mix of a little bit of ag and definitely some more urban type situations of wildlife control. So I think that trip alone would be worth the trip. And then of course they'll have 3 days of presentations. Low key, you're going to be able to meet the speakers. Each talk is only going to be about 20 minutes, except for the keynote, maybe some other keys talks will be longer, but typically presentations are 20 minutes. So if you don't like someone, they're only up there for 20 minutes. So sometimes people get tired of a talk. You won't have long talks, to be sure. And then of course they'll have vendors. Definitely check it out. We're going to put a link in the cast. So just look down below and you'll see the link to how to register. And also check out the proceedings because this is the longest running vertebrate control conference in the world. Started in the early 1960s and it's been going every other year pretty much since. And so it's a wealth of information and context. Do stretch yourself. Well, Dr. Baldwin, I want to thank you very much for being with us. And you've been listening to Living the Wildlife is part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Do take a few moments of your time to subscribe. And if you like the show, definitely put a like button on there and tell your friends. Join us on Facebook. We're the Pest Geek podcast family on Facebook. Join us, join the revolution, as my colleague calls it. Raise your questions there and definitely reach out to me if you have questions, comments, you want to be on the show. You can reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts and, yes, even your criticisms. If you have something you don't like about the show, definitely reach out, because we want to be sure this information is going to be useful for you out in the wildlife control land or Pest Geek podcast land. And again, this is Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.